So most people think you need to spend thousands of dollars or do a large scale renovation to make your home look amazing, but you don't. You often just need to stop making the 4 mistakes I'm about to share with you. These are the same mistakes that quietly sabotage great spaces and hold them back from reaching their full potential. And the last one might be the most important because it'll definitely have the biggest impact on making your place feel like home. So does it ever feel like you're stuck in a loop with your house? You buy a cool new lamp, but suddenly the side table next to it looks weird. You swap the table, but now the rug feels tiny and awkward. And it's been 3 years and the room is still stuck in that almost finished phase. Well, you're essentially caught in a cycle of small fixes, and this is one of the main reasons people end up hating their homes even after spending a fortune, because you're just moving the ugly from one corner of the room to the other. But the real issue is that most of us shop from the bottom up. Whenever you come across a nice vase or a trendy chair, you grab it because it seems fun, and it feels like a win in the moment. But real designers don't do this. Designers do the opposite and work top down. So you can think of working top down as having a roadmap. You figure out the big stuff, like where the furniture goes and how the room should feel, but that's before you ever buy anything. Because without having a plan, which is mistake number 1 here, your larger purchases get bullied by your smaller ones. Let me explain. Let's say you buy a rug for $100 because it was being sold at a deep discount, but the rug has a weird pattern and comes in a very specific shade of blue. And so now that you've chosen the rug, you're forced to find a sofa that doesn't clash with it, paint that matches it, and art that looks okay next to it, which means you've essentially let a cheap impulse purchase dictate how you spend thousands of dollars on the big important stuff. It's like a summer intern walking into a company's boardroom and firing the CEO. So you aren't optimizing for what you actually like anymore. You have to choose whatever fits that rug. And this is how you end up with a room that feels like a total accident instead of a place you designed from the ground up. So how do you break out of this? You have to nail the order of operations. And that definitely means avoiding impulse purchases, but more importantly, it means choosing the items with the fewest options first. So let's walk through an example so you know exactly what I mean. Maybe there are 3 or 4 sofas in your price range that you actually like and that fit well with your room. But on the flip side, there are hundreds of different paint colors you could choose from. So that means that it's much easier to find a paint color that matches a specific sofa, but much harder to find a sofa that matches a specific paint color. So if you paint first, you're basically boxing yourself into a corner before you've even started. And that's why it makes so much more sense to start with something hard like the sofa and leave the easy stuff like the paint for last. Because when you develop a plan using a top-down approach, the tail stops wagging the dog, and you stop being a hostage to your own impulse buys. But even once you've got your plan in place, it's still not enough, because mistake number 2 is what I call layout rigidity, and this really is the silent killer of a home's energy. It's that mental lock where once you drop your sofa into a certain position, it stays there until the day you move out. And so you treat your furniture like it's bolted to the floor, but that's a huge mistake because it keeps your home feeling stagnant and uninspiring. Because when a room never changes, your brain eventually stops seeing it altogether. You stop noticing the light hitting the floor or the way the space feels, and the room becomes a dead zone you just pass through rather than a place that gives you energy. Interestingly, psychologists have their own term for this, which is functional fixedness. And functional fixedness is a mental block where you can only see an object or a space in one specific way based on how it's supposed to be. And here's a perfect example so many people fall for. You move into a new place, walk into your new living room, see the cable jack on the wall, and your brain instantly says, okay, the TV goes there, which means the sofa has to go there. But what have you just done? You've just let a tiny piece of plastic dictate how you're going to live for the next 10 years. And now you're designing your life around the wiring of your house rather than how you actually want to spend your days and nights. But the exact same thing happens when you move into a new house and subconsciously adopt the layout of the people who lived there before you. You think, well, they had the dining table by the window, so that's where the dining table belongs. But that person's life isn't your life. Maybe they never use that window, but you love to read while you bask in natural light. So by refusing to experiment like this, you're living in the ghost of someone else's floor plan, and you're letting a stranger's habits determine your habits. And that's no way to live. Now, One of the most common symptoms of layout rigidity is the wallflower trap, where you push every single piece of furniture against the perimeter of the room. People do this because they think it makes the room feel bigger by leaving a giant rectangle of empty space in the middle, but in reality, it just creates a dead zone that feels awkward and hollow. It makes your home feel like a middle school dance where everyone is afraid to engage with each other. And so instead of feeling spacious, the room comes across as cold and disconnected. The furniture isn't in conversation with anything else, it's just clinging to the walls for dear life. So to break out of this, you have to float your furniture. And that means pulling your furniture away from the walls and into the center of the room to create conversation zones. Because zoning your space like this is what creates that sense of intimacy and intentionality, so your space feels like an actual home. You're building rooms within rooms without any renovations at all. For example, probably the simplest way to do this is to use the back of a sofa to create a physical and visual boundary that signals where the relaxing zone ends and the work or the dining zone begins. And then you can reinforce this by placing a console table against the sofa's back, which acts as a bit of a soft wall and provides a sense of enclosure for the relaxation zone without blocking the view across the room. Now, the goal here isn't just to move things for the sake of moving them. It's to make the room serve your life, not the life of the previous owner. Because if you spend 90% of your time in your living room hanging out with friends or playing board games, but all your chairs are pointed at the TV across the room, your layout is actively working against you. But when you break that rigidity and start arranging your furniture based on how you actually move and interact, your space suddenly feels so much more natural. You stop fighting your home and start living in it. And this is usually where people think the hard part is over, but they don't realize that the next issue they're going to face is already inevitable. Because the third big mistake that keeps your home from feeling right is what I call the density trap. It's that urge to either fill every square inch of a room until it's suffocating, or leave it so bare and disconnected that it feels like a hospital waiting room. Now, historically, filling your house with stuff was a way to show off wealth because the more clutter you could afford, the more money you had. But today, our brains don't perceive it the same way, because when a room is stuffed to the gills, we don't see luxury, we see discount aisle. Because high-density, cluttered spaces feel like a bargain basement, while low-density, intentional spaces feel sophisticated and high-end. And one of the problems with a busy room is that it creates cognitive noise. When your eye doesn't have a place to rest, your brain is constantly scanning and processing information, which keeps your nervous system in a low-key state of stress. So you're not relaxing, you're subconsciously making a to-do list of every object in the room. And this is why we all need negative space, which are the empty gaps between pieces of furniture. Because negative space is like the silence between notes in a song. Without that silence, it's just noise. But this is still only half the picture, because on the flip side, you have the sterile void mistake, which is really just a physical manifestation of analysis paralysis. Because this happens when people are so terrified of making a bold choice or a permanent mistake that they end up making no choice at all, which just leads to an overly empty room. The walls stay bare for years because you're waiting for the perfect piece of art, or you never move past that temporary furniture because you're too afraid to commit to new pieces. Now, to be clear, this isn't minimalism, this is a lack of confidence. And by refusing to occupy your own space, you end up living in a home that feels like it's perpetually waiting for someone else to move in. So what should you do about this? Well, you have to stop treating space as a problem to be solved and learn to value visual breathing room just as much as you value the furniture itself. And to do this, you might find these two simple ideas helpful. The first is the 20% rule, and the idea here is that whether it's your coffee table, your walls, or a bookshelf, you want to leave at least 20% of every surface completely empty. This makes the other 80% look much more intentional, and it gives your eye the breathing room it craves. Of course, 20% is the minimum here, and you'll want to include even more negative space on large surfaces like your walls, so your room doesn't look like a discount art gallery. But still, just having this 20% rule as a guideline can be pretty helpful. And then the second idea is the hero commitment. If you find that your home is overly sterile, but you just can't get unstuck, your problem is that you're trying to fix the whole room at once. So stop that. Instead, pick one hero piece piece, which might be a large piece of art, a bold rug, or even just a statement chair, and commit to it. Because your place is sterile because you're hoping for a level of perfection that doesn't exist. But by committing to one hero piece, you give the rest of the room permission to remain simple and fall into place. Because at the end of the day, your home should feel like a home, not a warehouse or a waiting room. But by finding that comfortable level of density, you stop fighting your space and finally give yourself permission to actually live in it. And by the way, if you want to see how your own home would look after making some of the changes I'm talking about, I've developed some tools to help you with exactly that. For example, if you're on a budget and only want to upgrade the lighting in your home, one of my tools will show you exactly how to go from a room that looks like this to one that looks like this just by changing the lighting. Or if you want to add some plants in your living room but aren't sure where to start, another one of my tools will show you which plants you should get to give your place that extra oomph. Of course, the tools can do way more than that as well, but I just wanted to give you a very small sneak peek now. So if you want to get full access to all the tools, check the link in the description. But once you get the balance in your room right, you start notice something else that's holding your home back. Not a lack of money or taste, but a lack of personality. Because the fourth mistake that keeps a home from feeling right is what I call the safety trap. We often treat our homes like a rental we're afraid to lose the deposit on, living in a beige on beige box because we're scared that a bold choice will eventually feel dated or that we'll just grow out of it. But by opting for the most generic, middle-of-the-road options, you end up living in a space that feels clinical and cold, like a cheap Airbnb. You're opting out of your own comfort today in favor of a safe version of a life that hasn't happened yet. But science has shown again and again that our physical surroundings regulate our emotions, so creating a space that feels good couldn't be more important. And when your space lacks any kind of personality, it doesn't just look boring, it feels ungrounded. So instead of designing for some future version of yourself, you have to start designing for the person who actually lives there right now, the one who needs warmth, texture, and a few choices that feel a little too honest to be safe. And I find a version of the 80-20 rule is helpful here, where you keep 80% of the room structurally timeless, things like layout, scale, circulation, and materials that age well, and then let the remaining 20% carry the personality. So that might look like a living room with neutral walls and timeless furniture, but a large piece of art that really stands out. Or maybe the art is more muted, but the sofa is where your eccentric side comes through. Frankly, the specifics don't matter as much as ensuring you strike the balance between where your room feels stable enough to be long-lasting, but interesting enough to be alive. But to be clear, this can be pushed too far, which is why I recommend showing some restraint. For example, when you inject too much personality by using bright colors in a way that only a small number of people would appreciate, you're making a narrow bet. But if you're able to express your desires through design elements that are distinctive without being polarizing, you can have plenty of personality in your space without locking the entire room into a single taste. For example, by changing the blue cabinets and yellow shelves to a more timeless wooden finish, you maintain the unique look of the blue floor, but make the entire room more palatable. And I'd personally go for something more like this, though this requires another level of renovation that may not be possible for you right now. Either way, I'm not advocating for beige and boring, quite the opposite actually. Just remember that when you display your personality through expensive, permanent decisions, you're narrowing the pool of people who might be interested in buying your home down the road. Now, as you're striking the balance between a hollow rental and a home that feels like yours, it may help to think about introducing sensory anchors, which are items that remind you of your own history, values, and experiences. Because a mass-produced vase from a big box store doesn't tell your brain anything, but that unusually shaped vase you found 6 years ago overseas comes with a whole host of meaningful stories that ground you in your space. So sensory anchors provide the emotional gravity your room needs to shift your nervous system from scanning mode into relaxation mode, turning your collection of furniture into a true sanctuary. So most people think the reason their home feels off is because they haven't found the right pieces of furniture yet. But what's really happening is they're making decisions in the wrong order and then letting fear lock those decisions in place. Because a room becomes stressful the moment a cheap impulse buy starts dictating thousands of dollars of future decisions, or when you treat the current layout like it's set in stone. But once you notice those patterns, you realize that the solution isn't to shop better, it's to decide better. But now that you understand what causes questionable design decisions, you're ready to start making some great ones. So the next step is learning a system that ties all this stuff together. So watch this video next, where I'll teach you one of the design frameworks I've developed for turning boring, uninspiring rooms into spaces you love to spend time in.